So we are in chapter 18 of Bhagavad-gita, perfection of renunciation, conclusion, the perfection of renunciation. And we're on verse 17, is that correct?
Yes.
Interesting section here, and also a very mysterious section. I was happy to get a chance to actually focus on this section because, strangely enough, some of these verses have come up real recently in my other talks in other places and what other devotees have been talking about. So here we are. So here is the translation of the entire verse. One who is not motivated by false ego, whose intelligence is not entangled, though he kills men in this world, does not kill, nor is he bound by his actions. So I say, and you please repeat. One who is not motivated, by false ego, whose intelligence is not entangled, though he kills men in this world, does not kill, nor is he bound by his actions. Okay, so here's the purport Prabhupada gives us. In this verse, the Lord informs Arjuna that the desire not to fight arises from false ego. Arjuna thought himself to be the doer of action, but he did not consider the supreme sanction within and without. If one does not know that a super sanction is there, why should he act? But one who knows the instruments of work, himself as a worker and the Supreme Lord as the supreme sanctioner, is perfect in doing everything. Such a person is never an illusion. Personal activity and responsibility arise from false ego and godlessness, or a lack of Krishna consciousness. Anyone who's acting in Krishna consciousness under the direction of the Super Soul, or the Supreme Personality of Godhead, even though killing does not kill, nor is he ever affected by the reaction of such killing. When a soldier kills under the command of a superior officer, he is not subject to be judged. But if a soldier kills on his own personal account, then he is certainly judged by a court of law. Yasya naham krito bhavo buddhir yasya nalipyate hatvapi sa iman lokan nahanti na nibhadyate. One who is not motivated by false ego, whose intelligence is not entangled, though he kills men in this world, does not kill, nor is he bound by his actions. So this verse is tangled in with the preceding and the anteceding, the following verses. So this kind of requires to talk about a whole group of verses in conjunction here. This is kind of an interesting and somewhat mysterious section. This chapter is called The Conclusion, the Perfection of Renunciation. So this chapter is actually kind of a summary chapter, just like the second chapter is a summary chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. I call both of these chapters double-wide chapters because they've got twice as many verses as the other chapters on the average. So both chapter 2 and chapter 18 have 70 some odd verses. I think chapter 2 has 72, this one has 78. So these both verses are summaries. So actually, in public speaking, I read one thing which described that when you speak publicly, you should explain what you're going to speak in a summary fashion, then you should speak, and then you should summarize. So tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. That's an interesting kind of view. You tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you just told them. So this is kind of what the Bhagavad-gita does, the same strategy. In the beginning, it tells you what you're going to hear, then you hear it, and then there's a summary. So from 1 to 12, in this 18th chapter, we hear kind of a summary of the concept of karma or action, particularly materially focused action, and how to rise above it. Then we hear this section, which is a summary of Gyan, which goes from 13 to 18. So this verse and the next verse, and it started with 13. Then from 19 all the way up through 72, we have what is sometimes called the yoga ladder, where we hear a breakdown of different levels of spiritual realization, and it's discussed in the context of the three modes of nature. So 18 also deals with the topic of the three modes of nature. Chapter 14, chapter 17, and chapter 18, all three deal with three modes of nature, which is a concept that you will not find in any other religious scripture anywhere in the world. And it's a very interesting concept. In fact, when people are talking about Western philosophy, it never comes up. Nobody ever talks about the three modes of nature. Only in Bhagavad-gita, and actually especially in the Bhagavad-gita, which is strange because usually the Bhagavad-gita just does a summary of all Vedic information. But here in the Bhagavad-gita, Krishna really focuses on the three modes of nature, which is more elaborate than it is anywhere else as far as I know. But here, in this section, of course, I want to start out by first just chopping off a little segment where we talk about this idea that's presented directly in this verse, 18.17, that Krishna is speaking directly to Arjuna because he wants Arjuna to understand that if he fights this battle of Kurukshetra, he will not be involved in any karmic reaction. That's the reason why he's hesitating to fight. Arjuna is thinking, we're fighting largely because we want to become the rulers of the world, and that's not particularly a good motive. Why are we fighting for this reason? That's what he mentions in the second chapter. And the first chapter, we have Arjuna's reasons for not wanting to fight. And here, Krishna is directly addressing that concern. He's saying that if a person acts not out of false ego, then even if he kills people, he's not killing them. So most of us understand this intuitively. This is not such a shocking verse. We, especially in New York City, you might see a policeman shooting at somebody. Normally, nobody shoots at someone else unless they're, mentally imbalanced or something like that. But a policeman may do it, and a policeman may do it because he is deputed by our society to be able to engage lethal force in some cases to stop certain people from doing certain things. So if a policeman shoots somebody, of course these days, and I can understand why, policemen are, and also other people involved in some kind of activity that's either military or police in its nature, if they're not self-controlled, they can certainly shoot someone just out of their own anger or out of their own something. And this is the danger in wielding lethal force, that unless one is very self-controlled, then lethal force can be used inappropriately. So if a person is using lethal force in the line of duty as a soldier or a policeman does, then one cannot hold the soldier or the policeman accountable. However, if either the soldier or the policeman step outside the parameters or the envelope of their duty, then certainly they can be called into question. That was the first point I just want to address. Any questions about that? If not, then we'll move on to the next section, which I want to tie this into all the verses in this little section on jnana from 13 to 18. Any questions? Yeah. Marlene?
So the idea is that if you're acting under authority, then you can do it.
Right.
And we see in history, there are people who felt that the Lord was instructing them to commit violence.
Mm-hmm.
So here we are, we're justifying what they did. Because
Mm-hmm.
after all, so how do we address?
Good question. One has to genuinely know what religious principles are. That's where people can justify anything when essentially there's nothing to go from. If there is no sense of what religious principles are, then certainly one can say, I was being told by God to kill this person, and I did it, so therefore I'm not culpable. But in the Bhagavad-gita, we have an understanding of what the cases are where such violence is justified. Of course, we understand that a kshatriya's duty, the word kshatriya comes from kshat and triyate. So kshat means to cut, and triyate is to deliver. So a kshatriya essentially delivers one from being harmed by another. And ironically, a kshatriya has to save someone from being harmed by harming somebody else. So this is the nature of kshatriya activity. Every society on the planet has always had such a class of people. They may be called by various names. In India at one point, there was a whole group of people based on their birth who would take this role. Now it's different than that. But in every society, there were always people who took this role. Sometimes they were paid to do it. Sometimes that was their lot in life. And sometimes, for other reasons, they chose that line of work. And if a person understands what the duties are of a kshatriya, and they're not just made up, they're not arbitrary, and they're not, subject to some kind of speculation. If one actually understands what they are, then one will know when it's appropriate to use such force and when it's not. There have always been different religions in the world. There will always be different religions in the world. If one decides that simply because someone belongs to a different religion, then they are basically like a target in one of these carnival games or something like that, then one is certainly not going to get any, relief from such a karma that comes their way from having thought that way. They may think like that, even they may point to their scripture that says like that, but in the Vedic literatures, there's no sanction for such activity. There is a sanction for self-defense. There is a sanction for people who are attacking. There are 6 kinds of people who may be killed in everyday life. The poison giver, the one who attacks all of a sudden with deadly weapons, the one who steals the house, the one who steals the wife, the one who does something else. I don't remember all of them right now, but there's a certain classification of people who, according to Vedic codes, can be killed with no sin incurred, because they're an aggressor of some sort. And there's no mention of somebody being of a different religion. So people variously concoct various ideas and create some kind of conflict based on those ideas. And basically our whole Western civilization has been case study in monstrous proportion of how people want to eradicate others who think differently than they do. But that's never been one of the principles in the Vedic literature. There certainly always will be people who think differently. But to simply want to kill them, to get rid of them, to either convert them or kill them, that's not sanctioned activity. So, at any rate, I can...
Can I push it a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
So there are two instances that come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
So someone is attacking my holy place that I can
Right.
the scriptures consider holy. Therefore, I have to protect them. Problem is, there are two religions that think the same place is holy.
Right.
So that's one example. And the other one, I'm not that familiar with it, but I understand that it was a young girl who thought God was telling her that she had to lead her people against those who were oppressing her. Her name was Joan of Arc.
Mm-hmm.
So it almost sounds like they could justify it a little bit based on, so is this such a, a gray areas that unless, Krishna taps you on the shoulder, you better just stay away? How do you do it? Well,
this particular issue, I won't get into it because this gets really complicated if we go further. But it's come up recently. We were discussing in Brooklyn the idea of Arjuna capturing Ashvathama after Ashvathama had thrown a Brahmastra, an atomic weapon, against the Pandavas, and later it was shunted toward the womb of all the Pandava women, including Parikshit. So Arjuna captured him, and by the codes of conduct, because he had massacred sleeping soldiers in their sleep, killed children, and was attempting to kill more children, he was immediately punishable by death. But he was a Brahmana, and Brahmanas generally are never killed. But he was on the battlefield. So there are all these conflicting issues. So you have this kind of thing crop up, not even as an unusual situation, but it comes up. So what to do in this situation? And Krishna even pushes Arjuna by saying, in the 7th chapter of the 1st canto, he's saying, my dear Arjuna, so this man has been the killer of innocent children in their sleep, and you have promised your wife Draupadi that she would be avenged for the death of her children, and I say that he should be killed. But yet he's a Brahmana, and he's our spiritual master, and he's the only surviving son of your martial teacher. So you have to satisfy me and Bhimsena and all these others. So he knows that he's put Arjuna in one of those, well, what do we really do here, And eventually what Arjuna winds up doing, as he gives Ashvathama the first known example of a punk haircut, He carves off some portions of his head and leaves other portions, which humiliates Ashvathama, and he takes a jewel from his head, but he doesn't kill him. So he's been, we could say, character assassinated or something like that. So in one sense he's killed, in another sense he's not. So these kind of things come up. And Bhishma Dev, dying on the battlefield when he's speaking with Yudhishthir, who wants to know the principles of religion, he tells Yudhishthir at one point, my dear Yudhishthir, the codes of religion are not always black and white. What I'm speaking to you is the result of understanding the codes of religion and wisdom. So sometimes one has to understand and read between the lines. And Krishna actually creates these kind of situations just so a person will be pushed to try to understand what's really justice in this situation. And it may not be at all clear. There may certainly be codes that pertain to the situation, but those codes may not exactly apply, and there may be extenuating circumstances or complicating circumstances. So this is why we have judges, and this is why we have lawyers, and this is why we have all these other classifications of people, to try to get to what really should be done in a situation like that. So as you say, there's an overlay of different concerns. And because there is an overlay of different concerns, a person who is devoted, thinking, and wanting to apply spiritual life to an actual everyday situation will sometimes have to work their way through several levels. And it may be a none of the above kind of situation like what Arjuna chose, So yes, many people do. Actually in India, the place where Krishna really took birth was a temple, and then the Muslims came and destroyed that temple and built a huge mosque right next to it, and then the Hindus built a small temple right next to it. But there's no plan to go kill the Muslims and remove their big temple and all that kind of stuff. So this kind of stuff happens in modern world, where people are envious over just what people believe, So in the Eastern tradition of India, there's never been a thing where thousands of Hindus went out just to massacre people of other religions for no apparent reason into places that they'd never been. They said, hey, we've never been over here on this side of the woods. Let's kill everybody and make them our religion. There's never been a thing like that. But other religions can't exactly say the same thing, So, at any rate, this is something that I'm just going to stop here, or we'll get off on an entire different tangent. We probably already have. But, at any rate, any other questions? If not, I'm going to move into tying this particular sloka, this 18.17, into this whole section about Gyan, which stretches from 13 to 1819, I think, or 1818, I think is what it is. All right. So this is a very interesting chapter, and a very interesting subsection of that chapter, because Krishna is talking about the concept of jnana. What really is knowledge from a Vedic point of view? And knowledge is a very important thing. Everybody thinks it's important, but not everyone has the same understanding of what in the world it even is. What do we mean when somebody has knowledge, even from a philosophical point of view, Western philosophy, describe knowledge without using the verb knowledge or any of its, past tense, future tense, or any of its other, or any noun that's made from it, to know, knowledge, all these things. It's very hard to explain what it really is. Basically, in the Western philosophy, knowledge is described as justified true belief. JTV. That's the JTV version of what knowledge is. So truth means that one says something and it corresponds with some reality, either present or past. One says something, that's truth. But knowledge is more than truth, because knowledge assumes some kind of structural analysis of something, whereas truth, I can say that it's going to rain. And if it actually does rain, you can say that what I said was true. But can you say that what I said was knowledge? I may have just guessed, or I may have read the weather report. So there's a difference between if you say something and it comes about, or it was in the past, then that's true. We don't ask whether you understood it or not. We just care whether what you said is correlating with what's true. But when we talk about knowledge, we assume that you not only said the truth, but there's something more to it, and that's where the justified true belief comes into. Of course, There was a man, Gettier, who came up with a side issue there. I'm not going to get into that, but Gettier cases. But the basic idea of knowledge is like that. But in the Vedic system, the word knowledge is different. When we speak about knowledge, we're speaking about something a little bit different than that, although there is certainly a correlation. Knowledge means to understand our position in this world and what the end game really is. That's what knowledge actually means. Of course, Krishna has described it in a couple of different ways. This chapter, chapter 18, if we go back a few verses, we hear about this 5 causes of action, which is verse 13, where according to Vedanta, there are 5 causes for the accomplishment of all action. Now learn of these from me, and here they are. The place of action, the body, the performer, the various senses, the different kinds of endeavor, and ultimately the supersoul. These are 5 different kinds of action. Adhishtanam, the body or the environment. Karta, the worker. Kartaram, the senses. Cheshta, the endeavor. And finally, Daivam, the supreme. So, whatever right or wrong actions a man performs by his body, mind, and speech is caused by these factors. One who thinks himself the only doer, not considering these 5 factors, is certainly not very intelligent and cannot see things as they are. And then we're at the verse that we're discussing today. One who is not motivated by false ego, whose intelligence is not entangled, though he kills men in this world, does not kill, nor is he bound by his actions. And then the next verse, maybe we'll get into it, maybe we won't. Knowledge, the object of knowledge, and the knower are 3 factors that motivate action. The senses, the work, and the doer are 3 constituents of action. So here we're having a scientific breakdown of how things occur in the world that we live in. And this is what's missing, both from our religious worldview of Western religion, our philosophical worldview of Western philosophy, and even our scientific worldview of Western science. These particular analyses are completely missing. And these harken back to the 13th chapter of Bhagavad-gita, where it's called Nature, Enjoyer, and Consciousness, where Arjuna asks Krishna about 6 different items. He asks about Jnanam and Gayam, the Kshetra and Kshetra Gyan. He asks about Purusha and Prakriti. He asks about 6 Sanskrit words. All this ties together in a larger picture. Kind of like a scientist would, we are taking apart the pieces that create the reality that we live in. And we're studying how they work together. So these pieces, they work together in a very specific way. And when we understand that, then we become convinced that spiritual life is really our only alternative, or the only alternative for someone with any sense. Because all the other alternatives are certainly not worth pursuing, and they bring a person into a dangerous territory. That's why we're not interested in the other alternatives. If you were dying of thirst and you were in a desert somewhere, and you may have noticed that there were other people that were also heading in the same direction, and they finally came to an oasis, and you were about to drink water from that oasis, but somebody pulled you aside and said, "Don't drink that water. That water is actually poison. It won't kill you right away, but in a few weeks you'll get sick and then you'll die." But if you actually wait for tomorrow morning at 6 a.m., there's a truck that comes and it delivers actual water that you can drink and you won't die. So, although the water is there and it's tempting and you may see other people drinking, your knowledge will say, wait a minute, this is not a good idea. I'll wait till the morning, and then so you do that. So in the same sense, when you actually know how things are happening and why in this material world, you get the motivation to do things differently than you would otherwise. That's what we mean by knowledge, you know. So in the 13th chapter, we hear this kind of dichotomy between the body and the self. So one aspect of knowledge is knowing that we're not the body. That's a very important aspect. Most people are completely unaware of this very simple fact, that we are not the body. Now we may think, how can just that one piece of information have such a dynamic and important effect on a human being? But really, seriously, it can. If you believe you're the body, then death seems like the very end. If you believe you're the body, then making the body happy, comfortable, and exhilarated in some materialistic way seems not at all an unusual or an unwanted path of endeavor. But if you're not the body, then all these normal behaviors that most people take for granted get called into question. We begin to think, should we really be doing these things? Are these things really important? Maybe they're not so important. So if we're not the body, then what in the dickens are we? And of course, in Bhagavad-gita explains this whole setup. And this whole setup is called Sankhya philosophy. Boom, 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 boom. Sankhya philosophy. So the Sankhya philosophy has 24 parts. But Krishna then talks about knowledge back in chapter 13. If we go to 13:6-7, the five great elements, false ego, intelligence, the unmanifested, the 10 senses, the mind, the 5 sense objects, desire, hatred, happiness, distress, the aggregate life symptoms and convictions. All these are considered in summary to be the field of activities and its interactions. Did you get that? No, I know. There was a whole list of things. But I like this verse, 13.5-7, because it's tied into what we're talking about here in this rehash of jnana. It's tied to the idea of how we understand this strange world that we are enmeshed in. So to break it down real simply, and I've done this before, we have 5 knowledge-acquiring senses. We all know what they are. The eyes, the nose, the mouth, the ears, and the skin. And of course the tongue. The mouth, the tongue, right. So these are 5 knowledge-acquiring senses, also known as the Pancha Gyan Indriya. Gyan means knowledge-acquiring. So we have the Pancha Karmindriya, the 5 working senses, which are the mouth. It doesn't just taste, it speaks. We have the arms that work, the legs that walk, and we have the genitals and the anus. So these are working senses. We use the 5 knowledge-acquiring senses to pull in the external world into our consciousness. Then we use the 5 working senses to output into the material world. So we've got the 5 Karmindriya, the 5 Gyanindriya. Then we have the 5 material elements, which are earth, water, fire, air, and ether. These are 5 material elements or states of matter. Then we have something called the Pancha Tanmatra, which are the subtle sense objects. In other words, they're the objects in which the senses categorize things, which is form, taste, touch, sound, and which one did I leave out? Smell. So these are how the senses take the material external world and categorize it into things. So now we're up to 20. We've got 4 groups of 5. Then we have 3 subtle elements, which are mind, intelligence, and false ego. By the way, these 3 are material elements. They are not gross material elements, but they are material elements nonetheless. And they are false mind, false intelligence, and false ego. This 3 tripartite aggregate of mind, intelligence, and false ego, they are precisely what carries us into another body at the time of death. So this is what the subtle body is made of. By the way, the subtle body also has senses, but they're not the same as the senses of the gross body, yet they plug into it like a hand plugs into a glove. They are designed to dovetail and fit right into the gross senses. So we have the subtle senses that fit into the gross senses, and the subtle body, it fits into the gross body. The gross body is made of earth, water, fire, air, and ether. The subtle body is made of false mind, false intelligence, and false ego. And so now we're up to 23 elements. Then sometimes, as Krishna says, we could call it the unmanifested, we could call it the time factor, or we could talk about the soul, which is variously described in different Sankhya regimes as the 24th element. And so Krishna mentions it here in this one as the unmanifested. Now, these are kind of like the chessboard. Now, what are the legitimate moves on the chessboard? Now we have, these interactions, as Krishna calls them. Happiness, distress, desire, reactions, convictions, and so forth. So this is what makes a chessboard move. We can have the chessboard, nothing would be going on, but we have to have movements in the chessboard. So the movements are these things. Desires, which actually eventually create, we desire and are adverse to certain things, so we want to work in such a way as to increase the circumstances that bring us our desires and decrease the circumstances that bring us what we're averse to. And then there's reactions to that, which is karma. And, as a result, we get happiness and distress. So now these 24 things are interacting. Now we're starting to get a complete picture of how things happen in this material world. What is actually going on here? If you understand these things, then you see this in everyday life, in everyday action. We have 24 elements interacting in about 6 or 8 different ways, and this is what we call material life. When we understand this, then we begin to think, well, what is the point of all this? And we begin to realize that the point of it all is to gradually purify ourselves of material desire and focus on the supreme. Because by doing that, we get, again, true knowledge. And then later on, Krishna describes Vedic knowledge in this huge verse from 13.8 to 13.8 to 13.12. Humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching of spiritual master, cleanliness, steadiness, self-control, renunciation of the objects of sense gratification, absence of false ego, perception of the evil of birth, death, old age, and disease, detachment, freedom from entanglement with children, wife, home, and the rest, even-mindedness amid pleasure and pleasant and unpleasant events, constant unalloyed devotion to me, aspiring to live in a solitary place, detachment from the general mass of people, accepting the importance of self-realization and the philosophical search for the absolute truth. All these I declare to be knowledge. And besides this, whatever they may be, is ignorance. Now, if we went through, say, your average college, and we edited or evaluated all the courses in the college as to whether they did or did not meet this criterion, we would discover quite quickly that the criterion in most colleges would be they're teaching ignorance. So you can learn ignorance just like you can learn knowledge. But of course, there's nothing that says that we couldn't take the same courses offered in most colleges and bring them around in a way that they could be knowledge. But the fact is that as they stand now and the way they're usually given to students, they do not meet any of these requirements. They do not teach humility, pridelessness, nonviolence, tolerance, simplicity, approaching a spiritual master, steadiness, self-control, renunciation, absence of false ego, perception of the evil of birth, death, and old age and disease, freedom from entanglement with children, home, and the wife, even-mindedness, unalloyed devotion, aspiring to live in a solitary place. None of these things are brought around as any aspect of the curriculum in any college level presentation. So why do we see this? Because knowledge means to understand what is the real goal of life. And if one thinks that making the body happy is the goal of life, then one will agree with the college curriculum. If one thinks that understanding how to get free from reincarnation and developing a relationship with the Supreme Person is the goal of life, one will see that what they teach in college has nothing to do with that. So it depends on what you call knowledge. So if knowledge is one thing, you'll look at the world in one way, and if knowledge is something else, you'll look at the world in a completely different way. So Krishna is summarizing jnana in these verses that we were talking about, and of course in our 1817 we were discussing this idea of a person who kills does not really kill, and in the next one in 19, jnanam geham parigyata trividha karma chodana karanam karma karteti trividha karma sangraha. Knowledge, the object of knowledge, and the knower are three factors that motivate action. The senses, the senses, work, and the doer are the three constituents of action. So now we're hearing more. There are three kinds of impetus for daily work: knowledge, the object of knowledge, and the knower. Why do we say knowledge is an impetus for work? Because the person is going to college, their knowledge is that the body must be made happy by all means. So therefore, I need to know specific knowledge of how I can make the body happy, namely getting some degree and, begging from some industrialist for some meager position in some overarching giant transnational corporation. And that's what I think of as knowledge. On the other side of the coin, if I'm thinking that knowledge is that I need to understand who I really am and how to get out of the material world, then I'll do a very different sequence of things, and I will look at life in a very different way. In either case, this is knowledge motivating action. So depending on how you see the world, depends on what kind of action you take up. The instruments of work, the work itself, and the worker are called the constituents of work. Any work done by any human being has these elements. Before one acts, there is some impetus, which is called inspiration. Any solution arrived at before work is actualized is a subtle form of work. We call this planning. When work takes the form of action, first one has to undergo a psychological process of thinking, feeling, and willing, and that is called the impetus. The inspiration to work is the same if it comes from scripture or from the instruction of a spiritual master. When the inspiration is there and the worker is there, then the actual activity takes place with the help of the senses, including the mind, which is the center of all these senses. The sum total of all the constituents of an activity are called the accumulation of work. So we have things that motivate us to work in a particular way, and then we have the actual work. And in this particular chapter, we heard that there are 5 factors of action. You know, the body, if the body is in good shape, if the environment is conducive, then we can say there's a good chance for a good outcome. Then we have, that was called adishtanam in Sanskrit. Then we talk about the idea of the karta, or the worker. Does the worker want to do the work? You know, if the worker is not at all interested in doing the work, you can have a good situation, the body can be in perfect working order, the senses can be fine, nothing happens. You know, if we have a situation where there's something needs to be done, but the person who needs to do it is not at all interested in doing it, no matter how much facility we give, we see that nothing remains accomplished. So we have the worker. Then we have the karanam, the senses, and the senses have to be in working order, or else one can't accomplish what he's doing. You know, when I was in India, I got nicely sick, and I was experiencing a great deal of not so goodness. And at one point, I was just kind of down in a bed, and that's all I could do. You know, so if the senses aren't in working order, then one can want to do something, the facility can be there, but it doesn't get accomplished. The senses have to be in working order. And then we have cheshta. That was a mysterious one called the endeavor. You know, we see that some people want to do something in a very intense way, so they have great determination to do it. But if there's no great determination to do it, there may be some impediments, and then that leads to a dead end. Person can have the working senses, person can be desiring to do something, a person can have a body that's in order and everything is conducive for that work, but because they don't have determination, a few thwarting or impediments block them from completing the work. But more than any of these 4 is Daivam, the Supreme Lord. So sometimes we see person's willing, senses are good, the situation is somewhat okay, they're very determined, but they do not accomplish what they need to do because the Supreme Lord does not sanction it. On the other side of the coin, sometimes we see a person is lackadaisical, and somehow or another, it works anyway. So this kind of thing means that ultimately the 5th constituent or action is the supersoul. So the supersoul has to be the final say-so. All the others can be in alignment, all 4, but the supersoul can veto it. Similarly, all the other 4 can be in disalignment, and the supersoul can have it happen anyway. So this is the way it works. And the reason we're being told this is because when one considers oneself the only doer, then one is ignoring these 5 factors of action and thinking that only my determination is what makes things happen, not considering the other 4 constituents of action. All right, so questions or comments about that? We went through a lot, yeah.
I have a question from a Gyan perspective,
Okay.
my tradition.
Okay.
It's pretty clear that by chanting a mantra like the Hare Krishna mantra, you can purify the mind.
Right.
And you can basically get rid of the false ego.
Mm-hmm.
However, if a certain action, if you're inspired to act, how can you really tell, without question, that your action is the non-doer instrument of the superfold? Or whether your own cultural stuff, or whether you're subconscious, the mind is very insidious, and you don't always have the opportunity to check out the Vedas. And even if you did, people from other cultures wouldn't make a distinction whether somebody was a Brahmin or not, as you did in your other example.
Right. So that's a very good question, and that's why we have what we call the threefold verification of truth. We have what we usually call Shastra, Guru, and Sadhu, Shastra, and Guru. So if something lines up with all 3, then we know we're actually on course. If one of those three is a dissenting factor, then we have to wonder whether maybe something's not quite right here. The Vedas are vast, but understanding what's important in the Vedas is a very important aspect of the Vedas that gets into the whole concept of hermeneutics, which is right now a key hot topic in our movement. Hermeneutics is the study of what it is that Scripture is actually telling us. How do we understand it? Any scripture, whether it's the, Bhagavatam, Bhagavad-gita, or we're talking about the Quran or the Bible or the Old Testament, the whatever it happens to be, is coming to us from a time way long ago. So it's not always obvious what the words are telling us. We may misunderstand it, and we may have our own cultural misconceptions or preconceptions. So to understand that, we have to have three things that guide our understanding. We have to have the literature itself, because without the literature, someone can just make it up as they go along. But there is a literature, and we refer to that. Then we have our own personal guru, who is someone not just arbitrarily chosen, but someone who comes from a disciplic succession, someone who has had a guru himself. So no one can be a guru unless one has been a disciple before. And a disciple not just of anyone, but of someone of a bona fide lineage that goes back, So this is our second checkpoint. Besides the scriptures, there is a teacher or a spiritual master. Then the third one is sadhu. That means a collective of people both living now and people in the past who have presented the same conclusion in the same way. So if we have all three things checked in, then we know we're on the right course. If we have a guru that's saying something, we don't read that in scripture, we can discount that guru. If we have a scripture, but we're not sure what it says, then we have to consult, because scripture is sometimes ambivalent, not even ambivalent, it may be tri or multibivalent. It's sometimes there's a number of different interpretations that can be given to a single verse. So in that case, we research the tradition. What does the guru tell us about it? And what do the present and past acharyas, what do they say about it? And if we're following a bona fide tradition, we'll have all this at our disposal. We'll have the commentaries of previous speakers on the same topics. And since we're really dealing with the absolute truth, we're talking about those things which never change at any time in the past, present, or in the future, no matter how far forward we go. All religious literature deals to some extent with the absolute truth. Of course, the relative truth is also there. Some things do change, and some things do have to be adjusted according to time, place, and circumstance. But we have to know the difference between those two categories of things. And we have to have people who can help us to winnow out which one is which and put them in the appropriate category. And once we do that, then what we want to know is, first of all, what does the absolute truth say? And how does my present circumstance work against that? Am I talking about something that is pronounced upon by the absolute truth? And then what do the present and past acharyas have to say about it? What does scripture say about it? What does my guru say about it? And in this way, finally, we will know whether we've got our thumb on the scale when we're evaluating something, whether we're acting in a way that is guided by our own material desire or is guided by scripture, which is important to know. And in general, we can see that it's not easy to tell. So sometimes one has to do research, and that's why in issues where it's not clear what the real answer is, we have to ask more advanced devotees. We have to ask spiritual master, and we can even, if we want to, take an investigation of what others do say about the same issue, particularly even our past acharyas, what they have said on a particular issue. Okay. Yeah, we're...
All right, I hope you brought your sleeping bag. There's a lot to discuss. I have 4,000 or 5,000 questions, but I'll start with asking you to clarify some things in what you said. You began by saying that if I say that it's going to rain tomorrow and it rains, then you can say it's true.
Right.
Well, therefore, is there a distinction between a fact, which is true, and something which is not necessarily true? And then, because it's not a fact that it's going to rain tomorrow. It may be a fact today because it's going to rain tomorrow, but it's not a fact. However, we're not our bodies. That's a fact.
Yeah.
And so is there a distinction, and to what extent does epistemology come in helping us to determine say what kind of truths we're talking about?
Right. Well, this is something that Western people do not usually discuss. You know, in fact, in Western philosophy, I'm not sure if there is a concept of the absolute truth. You know, I've never really run across it much. In the Vedas, it's front and center.
They have a funny kind of absolute truth. They often say there's no absolute truth. It's just an absolute truth.
Right. That's the interesting sort of self-rejection of the self-refuting philosophy that you come around to with that kind of thing. So in modern Western philosophy, people usually think that everything is up for grabs over time, but they don't really stop to think about what such a view would really entail. But in the Vedic conception, this is front and center. We start talking about this from the very beginning. What's eternal truth? And relative truth doesn't mean it's fiction, but it means it might be transitory. So there are details which change from time and place. Trump wasn't always president. And hopefully he won't be president next time around, but we'll see. But some things never change. The fact that we have a material body and we're souls, that's not going to change 50,000 years from today. And it was true a million years ago. This is something that doesn't change. It's not something, many people in the Western world, because there's so much confusion about philosophy, and people have no idea in the Western world generally what philosophy is, how to think about it in a clear way. So they think because I'm confused about philosophy is a kind of Pillsbury Doughboy thing that's not really here or there and can be molded in any kind of way, but this is not actually philosophy. It's quite true, you can believe anything you want, but there's, that nasty reality that if you believe something that's not actually true, you will be gradually ground down by the fact that you are living in an illusion and it's not working. If you believe something that is true, over time you will find that that doesn't happen to you. As a matter of fact, you become relieved from various issues and things like that. So there's a benchmark for the actual truth, the absolute truth. Whereas, when I said what I was saying at first, I was speaking from a Western philosophical perspective. And generally, as far as Western philosophy goes, when we talk about knowledge, that's what they talk about, JTB, justified true belief, with the Gettier exceptions factored in. There's few ways that people handle the Gettier exceptions. Other questions? I know that was a lot to throw at you. But you can see that it's there. We have all these little categories. And if we understand these categories, then, as I was saying before, with the example of coming to the oasis in the desert, we won't drink from water that's actually going to make us sick. We'll understand that we won't die, but we can't do what most people think to do, which is to immediately go to the contaminated water. We will wait for the right time and right place to get water that will help us. So when you understand what's really going on in the world, you begin not just to think about it, but you begin to see everyday examples of it being carried on around you by the people and the situations that you face and they face. And when that happens, you begin to think, it's only in my own best interest that I start to change the way I do things. And in this way, over time, I become liberated. Instead of becoming more and more enmeshed in various kinds of confusion and entangled in various kinds of action and reaction, I become liberated from various kinds of action and reaction. And I find that my understanding of what's happening is not befuddled at all. I can understand what's happening, understand why it's happening in the particular way that it is. Yeah.
Nobody else saw
Yeah. So nobody else is right.
Is it fair to say, and sort of a generalization, that Western consideration of knowledge is basically accumulation of facts, whereas when we look into that 13th chapter, 8 to 12, we see that Krishna, what Krishna calls knowledge is qualities, facts, and activities.
Right.
So we can make
attitudes, right?
So we can make that. Is it unfair to make that critical analysis of Western knowledge?
Well, I would say, the way I always think about it, you could categorize it that way. The way I usually think about it is Western knowledge is almost exclusively targeted towards making the body happy. That's its function, that's its bottom line, that's its end game. If you look at any college curriculum, you'll see that all the courses there are intended for, at least, ostensibly. I don't know whether it's actually true or not. In fact, many studies have shown that it's actually not true, that many college curriculums are supposed to make a person ready to be gainfully employed in the everyday world. Whether or not that really does happen, and I think there's a lot of controversy about that these days, but at least that's the whole point of it, so that one can learn an accumulation of math, facts, and physical strategies that allow someone to meet a particular need in the surrounding society and therefore be able to land a job in some field as a result. That's the whole purpose of the knowledge. Whereas in the Vedic system, that is not at all the purpose of knowledge. The purpose of knowledge is to understand why we're here. And, it's not that one cannot be gainfully employed. It's not that one has to live naked on a mountaintop in a cave or something like that. But the idea is that one has to at least understand that this can't be the goal of your life, that the real goal of your life is understanding who you really are as servant of God and recognizing that by serving God, by chanting His name, 9 processes of devotional service, one will become less inclined to want to work hard for material body happiness, which is transitory, illusory, and never fully satisfying. We were talking about this last week. One of the themes of this week, I don't know how these things happen, but somehow or another I give several classes during the course of the week, and certain themes seem to emerge. And one of these themes is that no matter what you do, you will never be materially happy. And that you can, for some people, they have great material desires and they work like anything, but they never get close. closing the gap between their material desires and what they actually accomplish. Now, on the other side of the coin, there's a much smaller percentage of people who, because of their karma, work, and they do accomplish what they had set out to do. And in one sense, those people are even worse off, because they discover that the things they thought were important, the things that society holds as great accomplishments, are completely hollow. And when they get those things, they're completely, something happens at that point. It's like, you're on a race, like we just had with the Boston Marathon just a little while. You're on a race and you want to win, you want to be the first person, and you're running and you see you're getting way ahead of the people behind you, and finally you realize you're way out in front, and when you get to the goal line, you realize there's nobody there, there's no cameras, and you never see the other people come over the line, and you think, what was this? It's like that, and I'm maybe one of these days I'm going to do a whole session on, these people who made it and then broke it right at the same time for one reason or another, because they realized that getting those things that society considers major achievements is oftentimes very startling, because you are not at all satisfied by it.
When you were saying that, so education basically to make the body, give pleasure to the body,
right?
It's good, and we're gainfully employed.
Right.
So I was thinking, long ago, before I even took up the path of devotional service, so a lot of my friends, they went into the math and science fields.
Mm-hmm.
Me, I went into the humanities. I was sociology major.
I went into the math and science field.
So, and then I was traveling around the world like a bum living in a van, and there were a lot of sociologists around because nobody couldn't get a job.
Right.
So, but it seems that there's a move in current education to downplay humanities and
Mm-hmm.
emphasize those things that can give some meaningful employment.
Right.
Because
Right.
What can you do?
Certainly.
But when you say
College is a business.
right, so it's almost like at one point they were willing to educate not just to make the gross body, but make the mind a little bit satisfied.
Right.
But even that's being downplayed.
Right. Now it's totally economically oriented, and this is not kind of some kind of trend that's new. This is the kind of thing that's been going on since time immemorial, that as knowledge gradually becomes more and more focused on the body, it makes no sense at all to teach people philosophy or spiritual things. These things seem like, what's the point of this? Are you going to be able to get a better job because you did that? The question might be, well, you may not even want a job at all.
Because I like my mother, when I went to sociology, that's what my mother said.
Right. So people assume that their goal is the same as everybody else's goal, and everybody else's goal is to become materially better off so that one can enjoy the senses. And when you see that generally, as far as sociologically speaking, that really does hold true for the lion's share of the population, it certainly doesn't. It's certainly not wrong to think that let's streamline things for that end game. And that's what our society is exactly doing. It's streamlining things for that end game. We were discussing just, a few days ago about Howard Hughes, this guy who was multimillionaire. And, here's someone who made it in every sense of the word, not just in some sense of the word. He was famous. He was good looking. He had a lot of girls. He married a couple of times, but never really continued with those marriages. He had huge amounts of money. And he spent his last days watching movies in a closed hotel room with lights on. You think, what's up with that? It's like, here's a person who really had made it by many standards. You know, he was an aviator, he was into filmmaking, he was a mogul in very many ways as far as, you know, economics. He could really put together a thing. He had millions of dollars coming in on a daily basis, and he had servants, all those kind of things. But here's someone who really did run that marathon and come out way ahead of everybody. And when he gets to the finish line, he realizes there's nobody there and there's no cameras. And there doesn't appear to be any competition. And that's the saddest thing of all, when people achieve those things that most people think are the crowning moments of life and realize there's no substance to those things. And then they're honestly mystified by that. They don't know what's wrong. They think that I didn't do it right, or I didn't think right, or I have made it, I just don't realize it. You know, and you know, unless you've had some information about spiritual life, you will not be able to analyze that and come up with any true conclusion about it. You'll just think, something doesn't make sense here, but I don't know what it is. And the people around you certainly won't be any help. How are we doing on time, Atma?
7:26.
7:26. When are we supposed to stop?
7:30.
Okay. So we got a few minutes if someone has it. Yeah.
So Maharaj, the fourth chapter is called Transcendental Knowledge.
Right.
And, so Krishna in that, he conclusively says, you know, out of Guru, Sadhu and Shastra, he pretty much says that Guru is the only way to acquire knowledge. You know, so like, and he says many times, like, he says even like great personalities can't determine like what's karma and what's akarma.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so like, should Shastra and Sadhu, should that be subordinate to Guru, or should it be like equal?
Well, they should be equal. They should support each other. That's the whole idea. But if we really are talking about the absolute truth, those three things will agree. If we're talking about a relative truth, they may not, you know, but it's not important. It's kind of, you know, more down to some other thing. But if we're talking about the absolute truth, those three things should agree.
Well, in Arjuna's case, they didn't agree because, you know, he was sort of, he was citing all the religious literatures to not.
Right.
So
but he wasn't citing. He wasn't, you know, there in religious literature, even in the Vedas, you can find a reason to do or not do anything. You know, like, you know, as the saying goes, and I think Milton's Paradise Lost, both you and I read the Bible day and night, yet you read black and I read white. The vision of God you think you see is my vision's worst enemy. You know? So this is the nature that one has to have some guidance. And when one knows the absolute truth, then we can get a sense of whether what we're talking about is really an absolute principle or it's a relative principle that, you know, may be adjusted depending on some other considerations. Yeah, you have a question there.
Countries like Spain, Portugal, and France.
I didn't hear the question.
He asked if we have Christian temples in certain countries.
Spain, Portugal, and France.
Yes, we have Christian temples in most countries. And we certainly have them in Spain, Portugal, and France. Actually, I was just talking with Bhakti Prabhava Swami. And we had a very interesting conversation this morning. Because, you know, I don't know if you all know, but I'm doing a course here on Thursdays, this same spot here, I'm calling it What's Up With That? And we're doing a thing on reincarnation, which is the first segment. And we're going through different aspects of the topic of reincarnation. And I'm videoing it, so I'm going to put it on, you know, eventually my website, but also on my YouTube channel. And this I got these braces and little rubber bands that break sometimes. So, we're discussing this idea of how a person goes from one lifetime to another. And we did an introduction. We did some, 2 weeks ago, we did some preliminary explanation of what are the evidences for it. And then this last Thursday, about 3 days ago, we talked about research that's been going on about the topic of reincarnation in various universities. And so, at any rate, if anyone's interested, that's from 7 to 8:30 on Thursdays here. But when you do deal with these things, you come across this whole idea of people remembering past lives, especially children. And we were talking about this morning with Bhakti-Prabhava Swami, and he said that he, as a child, started having these dreams about a past life. And, it was very interesting because he was saying that he was born in 1960 or something like that. And just previous to that, in Belgium, there had been an enclave of Catholic monks who were in Belgium before, and they were Jesuits. And he had this dream, he kept having it over and over again, about being dressed as a monk, having a cross, and this was when he was a child. He'd never been out of Belgium. He remembered the heat of the tropics, and he remembered being cross-examined in some room, and he remembered being led out to some field somewhere, and someone putting a pistol in his mouth and blowing his head off, And it turns out that there were Jesuit monks that were massacred by a rebellion in Zaire. These things really do happen to people. And so sometimes people remember their past lives, usually because their past lives were traumatic in some kind of way. And in this case, it appears to be that way. And, he didn't have any idea why he was having these dreams. And these dreams are very specific, about being murdered and about the heat and about trying to get out of the Belgian Congo to go back to Belgium. He's from Belgium now, but at that time, evidently, he was from Belgium, and he had been a Jesuit in the Belgian Congo. And so he was trying to get back to his home country, but they took his passport, and they cross-examined him, and he remembered that he was going through difficulty waiting. And finally, he remembers being forced to march with a group of some kind of paramilitary, and at some point somebody put a revolver in his mouth and blew his head off, and he says even today he has this kind of funny issue with his vocal cords, and he has a headache in certain parts of his head, so we were talking about these things that, Dr. Ian Stevenson had come across with children who remember past lives, and here is a real-life experience. Yeah.
I got a question on that same subject.
Doctor, we should stop. You can do more questions during Sodom.
A quick question.
Okay.
I think we're
This will be the last question.
Okay.
Quick question.
Okay.
University of Virginia,
Right.
with Buddhist monks, have done those exact same studies that you're talking about.
Right. Well, it's Jim Tucker, who is the person who was trained by Ian Stevenson. He took over the post of Ian Stevenson.
They found cases where basically two different people have had the same, they don't call them past lives, they call them post-mortem survival, because two people have had the same experience that can be verified. How do you explain something like that?
I don't know. It's a good question. I've never heard of that, but Buddhists have a very different sense of reincarnation.
The University of Virginia's
Right.
psychiatry, psychology department in conjunction with Buddhism.
I know that Jim Tucker is a Buddhist because he has things on the YouTube as discussing his Buddhist views. But reincarnation is accepted by Buddhism, and it's accepted by, of course, the Vedic or the Hindu population, and it's also accepted to some extent by Jewish people. In those three religions, it's accepted, but generally in Christianity and generally in Islam, it's rejected completely, and that's for cultural reasons.
There's a philosophical reason, theological reason. In Christianity,
Right.
is their concept of the soul is some sort of tie-in with the body,
Right,
and
right.
therefore the idea that you take another body is completely
Foreign, right.
atheological.
Right. Okay, so Atma is saying we should adjourn. I'm going to have to wait to do that. I'm going through braces.
So no
It's like a teenager.
Mara said we'll adjourn, but you can talk to Mara during prasadam, which will be shortly.
Okay. So we do kirtan?
Yes, please.
Okay.